On today's episode, we examine an idea that aspires to scientifically re-engineer all of society. So today's idea comes from the collision of the ancient world and the modern world. And I know as soon as I say ancient world, Andrew's ears prick up and he is ready to get to business. So the ancient Greeks were obsessed basically with the idea of happiness. So they thought that happiness was like the final end of all human beings. So that means that happiness is the goal. It's the purpose of human life. Everything that we do should be done in the service of our happiness. So consequently, their whole value system, their whole ethics revolved around happiness. Now, the modern world, I think we're also obsessed with happiness. But we have another obsession that the ancient world didn't have, which is an obsession with measurement. So this obsession continues to haunt us today. Think about all of the different things that we measure. What are the things that you measure with your apps, right? So my husband obsessively measures his steps every single day. Like we literally run our entire life around making sure that he gets his minimum number of steps a day.
You measure those apps.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hate them.
You can measure your heart rate. You can measure your your sleep rhythms. Like people are measuring absolutely everything. And the more that we get these apps and gadgets that will track this stuff, like the more measurement obsessed we become. So the collision between this ancient obsession and this modern obsession gives birth to this thing, this bold new enterprise, the science of happiness. Okay, so when I say science of happiness, I don't mean like a science that studies what happiness is, like your brain states when you're happy or mental states when you're happy, but that's not totally unrelated. The science of happiness is like the scientific investigation of the means to promote happiness. So it's the science that tells us what we can do to become happier. So, I see this all of the time, particularly on my YouTube feed. Gratitude journals are something that gets really touted as being like the secret to happiness. Cutting down on social media, whether you earn enough money, meditation practices, all of these are different interventions, right, that we can scientifically study whether they help you to become more happy. And this science of happiness has completely exploded in the last few years. So my greatest example of this is this Yale happiness course. So have you heard of or taken this course? In 2018 was this psychologist at Yale, Laurie Santos. She started offering this course on happiness. And it just exploded. So what the course focuses on is like scientifically proven techniques for promoting your happiness. It has like a lab component. Wow. So you don't just read about it, you actually like do like the gratitude journal and all of those different things. So it was Yale's most popular course in history. She ended up making the course available to the public. So by 2022, I think this number is just staggering to me. Over 3.7 million people had taken this course. Wow. I think that qualifies as the most successful college course in human history. I think you would be hard-pressed to find a more successful college course.
So those of us interested in increasing enrollment, we just need to figure out how to get some happiness.
I know, right? What would you do with an enrollment figure like 3.7 million? I don't even know. That doesn't even sound like a recipe for success. I think this woman's whole life now revolves around nursing this course that's like this public service to the world. I don't know. Maybe that's great. Probably great. But this idea of a science of happiness relies on this critical idea. It's a controversial idea and has a storied history. And this idea is the focus of our discussion today. And that's the idea that happiness is something that you can measure. So maybe it helps to think about how does measurement work? What are some of the things you can measure? What are some of the things that you can't measure? So think about things we can. So I can measure my heart rate. That's really easy. Nurses do that all the time. I can measure time with a clock. I can measure distance with a yardstick. I can measure atmospheric pressure, the pH of water, all those things that you would measure in like a high school chemistry course. I can do all of those things. But certainly not everything important can be measured. So think about something like beauty. Like I know, Leah's looking, you haven't been introduced yet. Leah's looking like she thinks that maybe you can measure beauty. I can tell when someone is beautiful. I can tell when a work of art is beautiful. But I don't think that I can measure beauty, certainly not the quantity or magnitude of a beauty of a thing. I don't think that there's like an agreed upon measure or yardstick that I could have for the case of beauty. But that's just one example. That one's like maybe a little wishy-washy, like something like really more concrete. Let's say you do political science. You spend all your time thinking about governments and what makes them work. You have a core concept like political stability. Oh, this promotes political stability. This reduces political stability. But how do you measure political stability, right? There's different ways you could do it. You could talk about the frequency of wars. You could talk about the frequency of coups. You could talk about political conflict, but then you'd have to define all of those different things. Here's an example of something that I have a hard time measuring that's really important to me. Measuring my students' learning when I teach. I don't have a good way to do that. Like I assess it. I look at their book, their work, I come up with a rubric, I assign them a grade, I am assessing it. But that's different from measuring it. It's like somebody else who's really smart and really capable could look at that same paper and give it a totally different grade, maybe not totally different grade, but a different grade in a defensible way. And I don't see how we're going to decide between us. There's no like learning thermometer that I could apply to this paper to sort of calibrate the different assessments that we make of it. Okay, so some things you can measure, some things you can't measure, or it's harder to measure. So the question is, how about happiness? The science of happiness supposes that it's the sort of thing that you can measure. That's what makes it possible for us to get data. That's what makes it possible for us to construct studies to determine what interventions or practices promote happiness or harm happiness. So this is the idea that we're talking about today. Can you measure happiness? And to help us investigate this idea, today we welcome a special guest, Professor Leah McClimans from the University of South Carolina, who is an expert on the philosophy of measurement. And her new book, which we must plug, which everyone should read because it's awesome, Patient-Centered Measurement, examines the possibility that we can measure the perspectives of patients so that they can be better integrated into healthcare practices. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad to have you here. So let's just start with you. You spend a lot of time thinking about healthcare and medicine. Is this in your observation of these practices? Do people try to measure things like happiness, or maybe something correlated, closely connected to that, well-being? Right, another concept that's often connected with happiness.
Yeah, so doctors and healthcare providers, they don't try and measure happiness. Some of them try and measure well-being for certain purposes, especially when it comes to resource allocation. Well-being becomes important. But in the work that I do, and the work is more widely spread across different areas of healthcare and health research, what they're interested in is something called quality of life. And if the Greeks were obsessed with happiness, health researchers and doctors are obsessed with measurement. So
of quality of life.
Quality of life. Well, measurement of all kinds of things, not just quality of life. Measurement of heart rate and brain function and kidney functions and cell growth and all kinds of things. But
when people measure quality of life, is it connected to happiness and well-being? Is it kind of like this is their way of turning things like well-being into something that they can measure? Or is quality of life just kind of conceptually independent of these other concepts?
Well, I think it's conceptually independent of the other concepts. And I think that's because when you talk about well-being, historically well-being, at least in the measurement literature and the economic literature and the philosophy of social science literature, it's mostly focused on the good of populations. So you measure well-being because you're looking for an end that will be good for a whole population. So how do you keep people in stable marriages longer, right? So you're not interested in individual, but the population level. When it comes to quality of life, clinicians and healthcare researchers are more explicitly interested in the individual, even though they're measuring populations.
So help me to assess the understanding between quality of life and stuff like well-being and happiness. What is quality of life? So when you have a quality of life measure, what kinds of things are you measuring?
Okay, well, I'm going to back up 1 second.
Sure.
There's a couple things to say about that. So when we're talking about well-being, philosophers think about these things in terms of maybe capacities or in terms of subjective well-being. So they have theories of well-being, and they fight about what that might be.
Mm-hmm.
But I think quality of life, because I think it's conceptually distinct.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think quality of life is not the kind of thing we define in advance before we have to measure it. Actually, it's patients as they answer these questions in advance as we're developing these measures. We're coming up with general ideas about what quality of life means in a particular context for that particular population of people. But we don't try and define it any more than that beforehand. So I think it's conceptually distinct for lots of reasons, because the motivation of measuring quality of life is different. It's more about individuals trying to capture, I call it the autonomy model of quality of life, as opposed to the beneficence model of well-being, like doing good for the population versus like really trying to understand like what an individual wants. So that's like kind of more abstract level.
Can you give me an example
of what we're measuring when we measure quality of life?
So as you spelled it out, when I'm wanting to measure quality of life, I'm not wanting to impose a preconceived idea of what a good life is. I'm wanting the person I'm asking about to have their own conception. So I'm creating open-ended questions where through that process it's going to become revealed how quality of life is contextualized in that particular instance. Do you have like an example of any of this, or if I've got it wrong that sets me straight?
So we're not trying to answer. We're not asking open-ended questions. So
I see.
When you measure quality of life, you're measuring with a questionnaire. Everyone has seen these. You've probably all filled them out when you go to a doctor's office for especially elective surgeries. They'll ask you questions about, say, your mobility beforehand. So can you get in and out of a bath by yourself? Can you walk to the shops on your own? Can you run a mile? They'll ask you these kinds of questions. I had a hip replacement a couple years ago, so I'm very familiar with these things. They ask you all these questions. Those are not open-ended questions. They're Likert questions. They'll say like a lot, a little, none at all. But the way trying to figure out what the construct, that's what when we talk about quality of life, say quality of life with quad joints, like quality of life with your like hip joint or something. When you're designing the questionnaires, that's when you're getting patients involved. So you have patients, you have doctors, you have all these people coming together, and you're trying to figure out what questions you need to ask on those questionnaires. And that's when it comes this kind of context sensitive context sensitivity comes into play.
Yeah, so this is a good one. So what quality of life means varies depending upon the context. So one context is I'm trying to evaluate whether your hip replacement was successful or whether you need a hip replacement or what kinds of difference hip replacements make in people's lives. Yeah. And in that context, it seems like mobility is an important thing that we can then measure. And then by measuring your mobility, we're measuring your quality of life.
Yeah. But context sensitivity can be ever so finely grained down to just the individual. So I'll give you an example of that. So sometimes I live in Ireland and sometimes live in America. And I just got into America from Ireland. But when I was looking to get a hip replacement, they gave me these questionnaires there. And there's something called a ceiling effect where your quality of life is too good to get anything done. So they were using it kind of like as a cutoff period. So I could still run 2 miles. I could get myself in and out of the bath. I could do all these things. And Ireland was using these quality of life scores as a way of saying you don't need a hip replacement. Then I come to America and I fill out the quality of life measures. And suddenly I'm qualified because I couldn't ride my horse like I wanted to. And I was worried when my kids were on the trampoline that they would hit me and it would hurt. You'd get this kind of jarring pain and these kinds of things. So running the 2 miles didn't matter so much. It was this other kind of stuff that matters. So we could say more about context sensitivity. I mean, it becomes a measurement problem eventually. But it is also it also has to do with what you value or what's valuable in the different contexts.
Yeah, because I wouldn't be worried about making sure I could ride my horse. I don't think I've ever ridden a horse. And so maybe that wouldn't be like an appropriate thing to have on a questionnaire, right?
No, maybe not on the questionnaire. but are you using this as a cutoff, your measures as a cutoff to try and, because in Ireland you want to decrease the number of people that are getting hip replacements early, because then they're going to need revisions later on. That's 2 hip replacements for one person. You just want 1 hip replacement for one person.
Can I ask a follow-up question about the relationship between the thing that you can measure, you think, quality of life, and the thing that maybe is a little more challenging to measure, things like well-being and happiness? So let's focus on well-being for a moment, which is one way of construing happiness. It seems to me like the reason that you want to know people's mobility is because of how that impacts their well-being. And quality of life is one way of making more specific what it means for them to do well. To me, quality of life seems like it's connected to well-being. But I was interested to hear that you thought they're actually really different. So can you say more about why you think they're different?
Okay, so maybe I need to clarify. I don't think that, like, in the way you put it, they're not different.
Okay.
Like, quality of life and well-being are exchangeable. Like, I could talk about my quality of life or my well-being, but they're different because they've grown up in different ways. Their purpose in economics and social sciences, I think, is really different. The purpose to which they're being put there is really different than the purpose to which they're put in medicine. And that has to do with the history of medicine. And I think, and it has a different history in economics. So when we're talking about quality of life measures, or what they're sometimes called patient-reported outcome measures in medicine, I just think that the function is different than they are when you're using them to, I don't know, maybe measure childhood well-being for the purposes of like child abuse or foster homes or things like that.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about ways that this idea of measuring things like well-being or problems with measuring well-being comes up in the medical context. Let's change tacks to talk about whether this is a good idea. So the idea that things like happiness or well-being can be measured.
Yeah.
So this is an idea that medicine appears to some extent to be in the grips of. I know that I am in the grips of this idea whenever I'm seduced by reading the latest scientific scientific research on how to promote my well-being or happiness, in the grips of this idea. Is this a good idea? So what do you think? Do you think that things like well-being or happiness can be measured? Is this a problematic idea, or is it all systems go?
Okay, well, before I answer that question just straight up, I actually hate all this. I hate personally measurements. I have no interest in apps. I measure anything. I stay away from it a million miles away.
Yeah.
I hate measuring the days till when I leave somewhere. Like, I just avoid all of this stuff. But I'm constantly fascinated by measurement. I think it's so interesting. So, to think about whether it's a good thing or not, I'm just going to give you 2 perspectives that have nothing to do with medicine at all. So Horkheimer and Adorno, in their book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, are very concerned about this, what they think of as like the coming age of measurement. So they're worried about quantification. And their worry is like this. In order to measure something, you have to abstract away from particulars. So if you want to measure IQ, you have to abstract away from like the particular student in front of you to like something else that doesn't seem real in the same way, right? Like this construct that you can't touch or feel, or it's intangible. So you have to get this abstract quantity, and it's through that abstract quantity that you can then find something very precise about these entities in front of you, about the children in front of you. But in order to do that, get this thing that seems really precise and important, you have to get really far away from the actual thing. And they worried that we would become so interested in the precision. They saw this happening, so interested in the precision and these abstract quantities that we would forget about the real things in front of us. I think that's really true, because in quality of life and medicine, it's like the more we're able to measure quality of life, the less we actually know about the patient's quality of life in front of us. I think that's actually true. The like texture of their lives. Like what you know is you have these numbers that go up and down that tell you if a elective surgery was successful or it contributes to that success. So Horkheimer and Adorno thought measurement was really worrying because we could just start playing around with these things that weren't real and forget about the world in front of us. So you could be thinking you're solving problems, but just completely forgetting to pay attention to whether, like, what's happening in front of you. I think that's true. I think that happens. But measurement isn't just bad. So Ken Alder, he's a historian at Princeton, I think. He has this book, The Measure of All Things. And it's this really interesting story about the standardization of the meter. And if you haven't read it, you should, because I think it's really, really good. But and especially the first few, maybe the first chapter. And he talks about how in 18th century France, there are no standard weights and measures. So you go one place and the pint is this big, and then it's another place, and fabrics and weights for flour, it's different in every, I don't know what the place was, but
yeah,
every place you
like
go
all of the ports for the phone chargers.
Exactly. Yeah, they're all different. And so measurement was really seen, developing standardized weights and measures was really seen as this thing that was going to create kind of equality and liberating to the population. So measurement, I think, is so interesting because it has these like two, you're talking about the same thing, but it has these two pools. It can be dangerous, it can be liberating, it can be repressive. Oh, I find it really interesting.
I think what you just said is fascinating. I haven't read this book and I want to, and that was a great plug for that work. Your observation about how standardizing measurements was supposed to make people happy made me shake my head in stupefaction, because I had always thought of standardization of measurements as something more along the lines of what Matt just said, almost as an aside, ports and shipping, aka a way to facilitate economic growth. Once standards of measure are consistent between place A and place B, it makes it much easier to trade between place A and place B. You don't need an interpreter. You don't need somebody making calculations to assess the difference between A and B. So I'm just wondering if this has come up in your research at all. You're talking about the sort of charitable values implied by the effort to standardize and quantify, but do you look into the darker, or at least more overtly economic side that the standardization brings up?
So not the economic side, perhaps. I mean, yes.
Well, healthcare is business.
Sometimes, yeah. So for a long time, I was really obsessed with the way that these quality of life measures that I study, they're very self-serving in that they tell patients in the world that we're interested in what you think about your healthcare because you matter. But in actual fact, they aren't doing that at all, because in virtue of not involving patients in what questions are important, and then thoroughly standardizing the questions and answers and never looking back, you actually aren't involving patients at all in what they think. You're just having them pick an answer that you've already predetermined. And that just seemed incredibly self-serving and manipulative. So that was the cynical aspect of this measurement that I didn't like. The economic aspect, though, healthcare is business. And when the FDA started to support the creation of these kinds of measures in healthcare, suddenly people were making a huge amount of money, because you had a lot of researchers who had been working at universities, who were psychometricians, who could now work for industry, pharmaceutical companies, and make quite a lot more money creating instruments, whether or not it measured quality of life or, promoted patient-centered care was irrelevant. They were just churning out these instruments. But then, of course, the rhetoric was all about patient-centered care, centering patients in macro level health decisions.
The thing that came to mind for me, I mean, of course, there's the economic stuff that's relevant here, but the thing that came to mind to me is it sounds like it's just another kind of language of making it possible for me to mean something and you to understand what that means. And it would be hard to represent my quality of life in a way that's, comparable or even just shareable, something that I can convey to another person. And that sounds to me like to be very valuable, to just be able to share with others a meaning about my assessment of my quality of life or my well-being. I don't know. Maybe that's too optimistic.
No, I'm actually I'm really optimistic about these measures. So there's all these cynical things, but I think we can make them so that they do this. It's very hard for a large population to get individual understandings of every single person's quality of life. But I think like the book that I just published is all about what you have to do. Like, how do you create these measures and then subsequently analyze them so that they can remain faithful to the rhetoric, right, which is patient-centered care.
I want to tell a quick anecdote, if I may, that relates to Mary's question and your answer, Leah. My wife and I had a house guest the other day who was wearing one of those rings that tracks your heartbeat and respiration and all the things. And I greeted him in the morning and I said, "How did you sleep?" And he looked at his device and he said, "I got a 100, perfect score on my sleep." And I'm like Matt, and I think like you, Leah, from what you said, I detest quantification when it's not necessary. And I said to him sort of quizzically, "What does that mean?" And his answer was fascinating, and I'll stop with this. He said, "It's tracking my heartbeat when I'm in REM cycle, all the things we know. And for me, a perfect score on sleep means I wake up feeling rested." So I just love that he was able to communicate to me qualitatively what that meant to him while also referencing the quantification.
I mean, one of the problems with these measures is they call it interpretability. Like, what your question, what does that 100 mean? Clinicians struggle to answer that question on these measures. What does the 5 on the measure actually mean? Because, well, for complicated reasons, maybe we shouldn't get into. But part of it is that we don't have good theories of quality of life.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how notions of things like happiness and well-being play out in healthcare. It might be helpful to talk about its origins, right? That's part of the idea of the podcast, that these ideas didn't just come out of nowhere. They have a history, and understanding the history gives you a valuable perspective over these ideas that possess us. So the idea of measurement comes through, the scientific revolution and the development of early modern science. But the idea that you can specifically measure happiness or well-being originates from social reformers of the Enlightenment. And a key figure here is Jeremy Bentham, who we discussed in our episode, The Magic Ring. So in The Magic Ring, we talked about how Bentham basically wanted to reform prisons. He wanted to make them more humane, more focused on like rehabilitating and reforming prisoners rather than punishing them. But that's just one example. He wanted to socially reform all of society. He wanted laws and policies that would lead to higher employment. He wanted to protect animal welfare. He wanted greater gender equality. He opposed British imperialism. He wanted to protect privacy. He had all kinds of changes that he wanted to make. But all of these changes were connected by one fundamental system of values. He felt that society was focused too much around traditional religious values, protecting the interests of the powerful, preserving tradition. He instead wanted society to be focused around human beings and their happiness. He thought the whole point of everything should be to make people happier. So this was his guiding principles, guiding ideas. But if he's going to do that in a good scientific way, you've got to be able to measure happiness, right? But then the puzzle is, how is that something that you can measure? So there's all kinds of strategies that you can take there, right? So you can think like happiness, that concept means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So we've talked about happiness being connected to well-being a little bit. One way you can think about happiness is in terms of like good feelings, something like that. Like if I say I'm happy, I'm referring to like I'm in a good mood, or I'm joyful, or I'm talking about my emotions. But another way you can talk about happiness is more in terms of objective circumstances. And actually, that's truer to the origin of the term happiness. So happiness means full of hap. Is this a term that people use anymore? Full of hap. I am full of hap. So hap just means like luck. So to say you are happy is to say you're full of luck, or to put it in other words, you're fortunate. So there, happiness isn't like just a good feeling, right? Happiness is like a set of circumstances that you would define as fortunate. And that's where, if you go down that road, that's when happiness starts to get interpreted as something like well-being. And that's a way of thinking about happiness that was much friendlier to the ancients. But Bentham had a problem. If he wants to structure everything around happiness, and he wants to do it in a scientific way, he wants to measure it, how do you measure something like well-being? Well, he saw an easy solution. By happiness, we should understand pleasure, because pleasure is something that you can measure, right? And then you can use it in a whole ethical system that's devoted to maximizing pleasure or maximizing happiness, as Bentham understood happiness. So this is what utilitarianism is about. Utilitarianism is the ethical theory that says the right thing to do is the thing that produces the greatest happiness. And for Bentham, that meant the greatest pleasure, because that's something that you can study with a Likert scale. I can ask people, I can give them a questionnaire. How do you feel? Rank your pain on a scale of 1 to 10, and then you get a good science of it. So that's the direction he took. But that might not be the right way to think about happiness, right? Then you're maybe thinking of happiness in a way that helps us to measure it.
Which I just want to point out, friends, represents a dramatic departure from antiquity and the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. This notion that pleasure can be quantified, Matt, I wasn't even familiar with, and it takes a lot of mental exertion for me to get it. One thing pops in my head immediately, and that's the 15th century Italian philosopher Lorenzo Valla, who wrote an entire book about pleasure. And in his book, he says that Christianity is the religion that corresponds most closely to pleasure. Why? Because Christ, in dying for other people, exemplifies the greatest pleasure one can possibly have, which is self-sacrifice. So this kind of blows my mind in the context of what you're talking about, both in terms of the religiosity of pleasure, we think of hedonism as irreligious, and in terms of its unquantifiability. The other thing I'll say is that as someone who's steeped in ancient philosophy for personal reasons rather than academic ones, I agree with Pierre Hadot's notion of spiritual exercises, and the 20th century French former priest and then academic at the Collège de France famously argued that what Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and a whole host of other ancient philosophers were doing was spiritual exercise. And in my nearly daily study of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, his notion of hypomnemata, these reminders to himself, are all very qualitative efforts for him to recenter and refocus, and the notion of quantifiability would have been extremely foreign to him. So that's the perspective I take when I come to this, which is really shocking, and I think makes Bentham even more of a watershed moment than we might realize.
Yeah, I mean, I think Bentham's idea that happiness can be measured because it's something like pleasure has great currency today. So I've looked at like happiness research where people are given pagers, and at different times of the day, the pager goes off, and they're like, rank your mood 1 to 10, and they get all this data, right? So, I mean, one kind of question that you can ask about happiness that I ask my students is happiness the kind of thing that you can get from a pill? Like, could you take a pill that would make you happy? And my students completely diverge on this. But the half my students are like, yes, absolutely. Zoloft, Prozac, Soma, whatever it is, like that word, that's what I mean by happiness. But they're thinking about happiness in this Bentham way, as something like pleasure, a feeling, a psychological state, which can be measured in the way we measure any psychological state. Or some students say the opposite. They say, oh no, you could never get happiness from a pill. You could get good feelings from a pill. It could make you feel good, make you feel pleasurable. But that's not the same thing as actually being happy, right? And that conception of happiness as a set of external circumstances rather than feelings, that's the way that the ancients think about it, right? So that's why when you look back at the ancient world, you're like, that is not how people think about it. You're right. That's not how they think about it. But it is how Bentham started thinking about it, and now how many of us think about it. And part of the motivation is because it makes happiness something that can be measured, something that can be quantified, and something that we can then use in a kind of social engineering to try to create better policies.
So I'm just going to interject here. To this conversation, the whole conversation we've had, I think we've been presupposing what it is to measure something. And so we've been talking about measuring and quantities and standardization. But just like pleasure and happiness has a history, so does measurement. And it's ongoing into sort of right now. So do you need a quantity to be able to measure something? That's why when you were talking about beauty, I was kind of like, well, what is the measure of beauty? Like poets talk about the measure of beauty and the measure of an emotion or a soul. And they're not talking about Bentham utilities.
But they're also being metaphorical.
Oh, I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. And the history of measurement shows that you don't have to have, and maybe this is controversial, but measurement shows that there are unstandardized quantities that we still measure. So I have a good friend, Rebecca Jackson, who is right now a postdoc at University of Durham, and she has this really good paper on the drop. Drops that
like
clinicians
from the COVID test.
Yeah, like the
right,
COVID test, or you're giving your kids when they're small the drops. Drops are not standardized. They've tried to standardize them, but it's actually better not to standardize them. We measure better with unstandardized drops. And she has a whole bunch of examples of measuring instruments and practices that just defy our assumptions about what measurement has to be. So
this is optimism about our possibilities for measuring things like happiness or well-being. Well, maybe I'm thinking about measurements too rigidly as something that requires an instrument that can be standardized. But if I had a more flexible understanding of measurement, I would say maybe it's unproblematic to think of happiness or well-being as something that can be measured.
I don't know if it's optimism, but I think we sometimes think about measurement as a straitjacket. Like measurement is this one thing that we all agree on. Mm-hmm. And then we fight about what kinds of things can be measured. And for sure, there is a history in the philosophy of science of measurement and history in general that makes those assumptions and actually argues for those kinds of claims. But we can just say that no, they're wrong. That measurement it can be a much wider array of things. And thus we can say this is good because we can say with Horkheimer and Adorno, you know what? We can still have measures, but pay attention to the particulars. We're not stuck by, the abstract quantities and what the negative side effects, right? We can have justice and equality with 18th century France, introduction of standard weights and measures, and still live a very human life.
I was just trying to think just now of what the equivalent of drops are in the case of happiness. And I was thinking, the way that my spouse and I try to tell each other about our day, I had a good day, or, and it seems to me like that might still qualify under what we are terming measurement in your more capacious description of it. And so maybe one of the things that's happening is we're trying to think about how straitjacket-ish the measurement of happiness is that Matt is bringing our attention to. Yeah. My sense is that it's more in the straitjacket direction when we're thinking about all of the assessments that do tend to come out about, who has the happiest citizenry, right? Like those kinds of comparisons. They don't tend to be along the drop level or the I had a good day level. They tend to be, 96% of Norwegians are what, those sorts of kind of more straitjackety assessments.
So interesting. I was thinking that going into this episode, I was thinking that the measurement problem is that to get the standardized measure, you're going to be forced to focus on the wrong thing, right? So to measure happiness, you're going to be forced to focus on something like pleasure, something that somebody can give you a ranking on a Likert scale. But now you're convinced me maybe that isn't the measurement problem, but it seems like there's a different measurement problem, which is the specification problem. Uh-huh. Something like happiness, super abstract. Something like well-being, super abstract. But what we want to be doing in our science is figuring out how to take that concept and conceptualize it in a very practical context. So like your example of the being able to ride a horse or whatever, right? So you've got to figure out what well-being means for this person given the way they live their life. And then you have to make it very specific. It's like, it means that I can ride my horse, right?
You don't have to make it that specific. But I mean, measurement is context dependent. That isn't like surprising. Think about like even the things we think of as the quintessential measures, thermometers, super context specific. Like you have outdoor thermometers, you have indoor thermometers, you have thermometers you have your kids, your thermometers you use in the chem lab. They're not just one thing. And so there should be no surprise at all that, the well-being that you need for going home after work is going to be different than they need for a resource allocation.
Yeah, but I'm not defining what I mean by 98 degrees differently when I use my outdoor thermometer and I put a thermometer in my kid's mouth. 98 degrees means the same thing in both contexts. But that's different than when I say, well-being for Leah means riding horses, but well-being for Matt does not.
And well-being for Mary means not riding horses.
And I think I can circle back to Leah's point and maybe offer an alternative explanation. It's not so much that it means something different in your daughter's mouth or outside your house. It's that centigrade and Fahrenheit are totally context dependent. So if Leah's in Ireland and she says it's 25 degrees today, someone might say, oh, it's really pleasant. But if you're in Columbia, South Carolina, 25 degrees Fahrenheit has a completely different meaning.
Yeah. And I think, okay, so when you say well-being is, riding horses or not riding horses, but 98 degrees is the same, I think these are kind of different issues. So it's not the right subset of the population. Like among people, like you would want to look at horseback riders, I think, or you have to like define the context of the population in order to create the measure. Do you know what I mean? Like, I said the horseback riding thing, but of course I don't expect that to be the question on the questionnaire. It would be more like, can you do your extracurricular activities?
Sure.
And I can't do my extracurricular activities to the level that I wanted to be able to do them. And we would ask you that question too. So that would be another way of redefining the populations that you would be included in it. Does that make sense?
For sure. I was just thinking, in the course at Yale that's taught, in that sense of the kind of science that Matt is drawing our attention to, I think some comparisons are attempted at, who is happier, horseback riders or non-horseback riders or something like that. This sort of stuff does come out. And I think part of the challenge is, are these things even comparable? How do you draw any kind of comparability between this kind of subjective experiences of people who do different things, right? That's what I sense is the challenge, is how can we even have some kind of if not standards, maybe that's too straitjackety, but some kind of meaningfulness that we can compare across different domains.
And here you can see what Bentham was thinking and why it's so attractive. Because I say, well, Leah really likes riding horses, but Mary really likes reading books by the window. What's the common measure that we have? Well, the pleasure. Their enjoyment. That's the common pleasure. And so when we think about happiness, that should be the common denominator. That's Bentham's motivation.
Well, and this is why some contemporary philosophers think you can't measure well-being for policy purposes, because you don't have the comparability across the broad context.
Yeah. So measuring happiness, measuring well-being, can it be done? Can it not be done? What do people think?
Yes, it can be done.
Yay. I feel like it can be done, but to do it, you have to contextualize it and make it really specific in a way that hinders its ability to measure across context. So it's kind of like there's a plus and a minus. There's trade-offs.
But I think that's not true.
Yeah.
It just depends on what your question is. What do you want to use the measure for? It all comes back to like just the purpose. Like, what is the measure being used for? Sometimes you need fine-grained measures. And in fact, in those cases, there's a thing called individualized measures. They're just measuring one person over time. But then you can have broader questions. And then you're not going to get as fine-grained detail, but they're better. They'll give you like very rough estimates, but sometimes that's all you need for those purposes. So it's not that you can't. Sometimes you need fine grain. Sometimes you don't. The purpose is going to drive the measure, and what.
And the success is determined by the purpose.
Yeah.
Mary, Andrew, last thoughts?
I mean, I'm just thinking, maybe this isn't my usual optimistic self, but I've been thinking a lot about mental health crises lately and how those are represented numerically, and how important it is to be doing that as we are facing mental health crises, not just in the United States. It feels like it's really important to have some way of assessing how people are doing, because I think these kinds of metrics are astounding and alarming. That increasingly people are not doing well.
Yeah.
Right? And so certainly it seems to me like there's an urgent need to be able to say, okay, well, here's how you can address the kind of crises that is pushing people to despair. Now, I'm not on the hunt for happiness along the lines that we've been talking about thus far in the episode, but it just feels like some kind of comparability that might be able to pull people back from the brink is really important. Yeah, so some optimism maybe about measurement, and not so much optimism about what the purpose might be, a little bit more attentiveness.
Yeah, for my part, I'd just underscore what Leah said about purpose. It seems so key. And to your point, Mary, about a mental health crisis, which there certainly is, to my mind, if we're using measurements to help people, I'm all for it. If we're using measurements to profit from people, I'm not for it.
But doesn't this interestingly gets back to the question of what it is to help people, right? Mm-hmm. What improves their lives? Is that something that we can measure? Right? Like, right. Is that something, do we have any kind of objective yardstick to say what improves people's lives? Is that yardstick something like pleasure, or is it something else? I think that's the desire of so many to say, okay, how can we help people? How can we put them in a better place? But what even is that, and how can we standardize that? Is it possible to standardize it? It's the challenge of the question that we're thinking about today.
Thanks so much for joining us, Leah.
Thank you for having me, Matt.
Thank you, Leah.
Possessed is made possible by a generous grant from the University of South Carolina Humanities Collaborative.